Your host for this webinar. I am the CEO and the lead scientist at Nichido Laboratories, and I'm going to begin by just giving a bit of an overview about myself and my background. So I am a scientist and I specialize in the science of aging, or more specifically, the science of why we get sicker and frailer and kind of start to fall apart a little bit as we get older. Now, I am actually really interested in what happens to our cells as we get older and cellular aging. So what is actually going on within our cell biology that actually causes the signs and symptoms that we associate with aging? Now, this is actually a really exciting time to be in this field because over the last 10 years, there have been some incredible breakthroughs that have demonstrated that we can now understand what is actually causing aging at a cellular level. But furthermore, we can actually slow and even reverse cellular aging. So this is quite incredible to think that this is now possible. And this is an area that I am incredibly passionate about. So before I founded Nichido, I actually worked in drug development, working on looking at molecules that could perhaps slow cellular aging. And there was a couple of things that I noticed whilst working in this field that actually really led me to found Nichido Laboratories. And the two main things were that, first of all, being involved in drug discovery, I was at the forefront of some incredible scientific discoveries that were actually happening in the field. But I could see that these scientific discoveries weren't going to actually make it out to the people that would benefit from them for quite a long time, because drug development takes an awful long time to go from bench to bedside. So we're talking like 15 years before some of these incredible breakthroughs that could help people would actually get to the people that could benefit from them. So that was one little thing that I was a bit like, okay, is there any way this could be speeded up? The other thing that I really noticed was that a lot of the molecules that were incredibly interesting and actually worked really well when we tested them were often not suitable as drug candidates. And this is because they were very well-known molecules, things that were actually suitable for supplements and for topical products. And because of that, drugs companies simply weren't interested in them, no matter how well they worked. So they were kind of cast aside and forgotten about. So I was a bit like, well, hang on a minute. There's some great scientific breakthroughs. There's some great molecules. Can we actually use these in a different market and try and actually get this science out to people quicker? So basically, this actually led me to found Nichido Laboratories. And at Nichido Laboratories, our mission is to basically translate all of the latest breakthroughs in the field of aging into consumer products that people can actually benefit from now. So I wanted to take all the credibility of the science from academia, look at all of the drug discovery and molecule discovery techniques that were used in drug development, but actually bring these areas of expertise and move them into a different market, namely the nutraceutical market and the skincare market, because that was a way of actually getting the science to consumers much quicker to bring out scientifically credible backed products. Now that's enough about me. I'm just going to give a quick overview of actually what I'm going to talk about in this webinar and what I'm going to teach today. So basically, I am going to start by talking all about aging. So what is it and why is it actually happening? Especially on a cellular level, like what is actually going on in our cells. I'm then going to talk about two sort of concepts that you may or may not have heard, but I hope you'll understand by the end of this presentation, which is the difference between lifespan and health span. Then we're going to talk about new ways to kind of think about aging and how we can approach aging, and actually really then digging deep at looking at the causes of cellular aging. What are the cellular mechanisms that are actually causing this? And then finally, I'm going to finish up by actually talking about some of these breakthroughs that I mentioned, some of these strategies that have been demonstrated to actually slow cellular aging. So I am just going to make these slides bigger now, and then we will begin. So first of all, what actually is aging? Because aging, it's a word we're all familiar with, but when you ask someone to define it, they find it kind of difficult. Like, how would you actually define aging if you had to? Some of the things that you hear people say, they would say, well, it's just the passage of time from birth. It's the increase in number of days until we die. Depending on who you ask, you might get different types of answers. So, for example, if you ask a child what aging is, they'll probably be quite positive about it and say, well, we want to age, we're desperate to grow up. It's something they're desperate to experience. They kind of want to get older. But on the other side, if you ask someone who's maybe 49, you're likely to get a very different response. And this is because at some point in our adult lives, actually like adding on that extra year or putting that extra candle in the birthday cake doesn't always feel like something we want to celebrate. But when you really dive deeper into this question and ask people to really explain what aging is, people actually really struggle to explain it. They kind of say, oh, it's just growing old. Oh, it's a natural process that leads to death. But that doesn't really explain what it is. So aging is actually, I think, quite a difficult thing to define when you think about it, even though it's a word that we actually use all the time. So in order to explain what aging actually is, let's look at the science. Like, what does science say aging actually is? Like, scientifically, what actually happens to us as we age? Right, well, first of all, here's kind of the uncomfortable truth. Because although we might have thought that our life purpose was to be a doctor or an astronaut or whatever, our life purpose is actually to pass on our DNA. And after your DNA is passed on through your reproduction, your body actually ceases to be useful, at least from an evolutionary perspective. So let me explain that a bit further. So if you think about it, Mother Nature has basically designed our body as like a kind of shell. And the purpose of this shell of our body is actually to protect our valuable DNA and make sure that this DNA, which is the blueprint of life, actually gets passed through to our children, therefore sort of passing on the germline in one piece. Now, the problem with this is that life is actually incredibly destructive. I mean, the process of just living and being alive actually continually damages our DNA. So, for example, just by breathing, we're actually continuously damaging our DNA by the free radicals that are produced as a byproduct of our metabolism. It's estimated that you get about 10,000 single pieces of DNA damage in a cell each day, which is crazy to think about it. Now, on top of this, you've also got external factors like our diet and pollution, things we sort of inflict on ourselves, which is also damaging our DNA. So basically what's happened is that over millions of years, our bodies have had to kind of evolve some very clever self-repair capabilities so that when we do suffer all this damage, we can actually fix it so that we protect our DNA and then we can reproduce and pass our DNA on in one piece, essentially. But the problem is these self-repair mechanisms that we have developed actually are really energy intensive. They consume a lot of energy. And that means it's actually very costly for the body to actually do all of this repair. So when we're young, the body kind of says, well, we've got this DNA to pass to the offspring in good condition, therefore it's worth investing a lot of energy into repairing any DNA damage to make sure it is in peak condition. However, when we're past childbearing age, our bodies have kind of done their jobs and the body sort of figures out it doesn't really need to keep all these expensive repair genes and processes switched on. In fact, from evolution's point of view, we're unlikely to ever live past childbearing age. So why on earth would we evolve and have our bodies evolve to keep all of this expensive repair mechanism switched on? So what happens is the body actually starts to turn down all of this repair and maintenance in the cell, and damage can actually start to accumulate. But what does this actually mean for us? And how is all of this theory linked to aging? Well, let's take a look at this life expectancy graph, which shows the average human lifespans during the last 180 years. So if you look back at the start, in the 1800s, we were actually really lucky to make it to our 40s. You know, a lot of us died by the age of 40. But over the last 200 years, if you follow the graph going up, we've enjoyed like a significant increase in our lifespans. And this increase in lifespan is mainly due to things like improved sanitation, improved healthcare, vaccines, medicines, antibiotics, things like that, and also improved living conditions. So this means back at the start of the graph, back in the 1800s, where we were lucky to reach our 40s, aging as we know it now didn't really exist. And that's because we didn't live long enough to see any of the effects of aging. We would have died from a tooth abscess or during childbirth or something like that, long before we ever really had a chance to get old as we know it today. But if you fast forward to today, a child born now is expected to live well into their 80s. And quite frankly, we haven't evolved long enough to be able to live this longer life. It's kind of a new territory. So what do I mean when I sort of say, I'm talking a lot about evolution, but what do I mean when I say we haven't evolved to live this long? So I'll just dig into this concept a little deeper because it kind of gets you thinking. And to do this, I want to share this quote with you, which is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Or in the case of aging, nothing to do with aging really makes sense except in the light of evolution. So what do I mean by this? Well, think about this. So I've just shown you with the graph previously that not that many years ago, aging as we know it didn't really exist. And this is because, as you've just seen, our ancestors usually died long before they had a chance to grow old. So as far as evolution was concerned, any traits that would have helped us live longer were kind of pretty useless if we were likely to die from an infection, for example, in our 30s. So why on earth would evolution select for traits that actually maintained our bodies longer than we were expected to survive? Now, that can be pretty hard to sometimes get your head around, and it's quite theoretical, but just think of a mouse, okay? If this mouse actually got a mutation that made it live longer, it would kind of be pretty pointless, as mice don't live very long in the wild. They are likely to be eaten by a predator, like an owl or something, long before they're ever going to get the chance to live a long life till old age, whatever that may be for a mouse. So a trait that would help it live longer would be pretty useless. So it would never actually be selected for by evolution. However, if this mouse got some sort of mutation that made it faster at running, for example, that would be really useful for its survival and helping it reproduce and actually pass its germline on to offspring. So it's those sorts of things about that things that you've got to really think about when it comes to aging. So what I like to say is that evolution has actually done a really good job of optimizing our bodies to be good at being young, but not so good at being old. And this is because it's only very recent, in evolutionary terms at least, that we've actually started to live longer. So the problem is we're now living longer lives, but our bodies just haven't evolved to have the maintenance systems to actually match this long life. Evolution takes a long time, hundreds of thousands of years, but our change in living conditions has happened really rapidly, and our body and our biology simply hasn't had the time to adapt. And we experience aging as we know it today because for our ancestors, staying young for a long time was a waste of effort, really. And when you understand this is when lots of other parts of aging that I'm going to now go on to explain actually start to kind of make sense. So what does all of this actually mean for us? Well, I'm going to spend the next little section just focusing on these two terms, which I mentioned in the introduction, or more importantly, actually the difference between the two terms. So we've got lifespan versus health span. So the first is lifespan. Now, we've all heard of this, and lifespan is just simply the number of years that you will live. But the second term, health span, is less common. And actually, this is kind of a new term that started to become used more. And some of you might be familiar with it, others might never have heard of it. But this is the one I really want you to take away from this session today, because it's something that you will certainly be hearing about a lot more. So health span is different to lifespan because it's actually the number of years you will actually live in good health. So this is the number of years of your lifespan, or the proportion of your lifespan that I say you're actually spent living. Because when I say in good health, I mean you're not suffering from frailty, you're not suffering from multiple age-related diseases, you're still able to live a fulfilled, happy, independent life, doing exactly what you want, as opposed to stuck in a care home, which unfortunately many people, is the way many people are ending up these days. So what does this actually look like in terms of some numbers? Well, in the UK today, the average lifespan for a woman is actually 83 years. Now this varies kind of depending on where you live, but average it's 83 years. But as things currently stand, this woman would only be expected to have the health span of 64 years. So there's a huge gap between those two numbers. And essentially what it means is that she's going to spend an incredible 23% of her life in poor health. So that's only a quarter of her life. So that's, a quarter of her life suffering from frailty, multiple age-associated illnesses, not being able to be independent and have quality of life. And, quite frankly, that does not sound like something, we want to look forward to. But as it stands, this is the reality that we're facing. And why is this? How is this linked to aging? Well, the reason for this big discrepancy is that age is actually the biggest risk factor for many of the major diseases that we suffer, and indeed many of the major diseases that drugs companies are trying to cure. So if you look at these graphs here, you can see that as age increases, the top one, as after age 50, your incidence of cardiovascular disease is just shooting up. The middle one here shows dementia. I think if you don't have it by your 70s, you can kind of assume it's on its way if you look at these stats. Cancer, the bottom graph, up until age 50, the numbers are kind of just tracking along the bottom of the chart, but after that, it's just whoosh, straight up. Your risk of getting some sort of cancer massively increases, and this is just your age, not considering any other risk factor. So these aren't great stats. I'm sorry to put this out here, but this is actually what we're looking at. But aging's inevitable, isn't it? It's nothing we can do about it. It's a fact of life. That's what we've kind of all been brought up to believe. It's this natural process, and I like to say that we're sort of conditioned to believe that our life trajectory is that we are born, we then learn, we earn, we retire, then we expire. We get all of these age-related diseases, and that's just the way it is, and there's just nothing we can do about it. I'm assuming, this is probably what many of you guys kind of feel, that this is the way things will probably go. But what if we could actually slow or stop or even reverse aging? How would we feel about that? Like, how would this change things if we could slow cellular aging? Does this mean that actually we would reduce our risk factor for all of these diseases? Does it mean that we would be able to live longer, healthier lives, and perhaps more importantly, just live healthier for longer? Well, this is exactly the question that scientists in the field of aging started to ask, about 10 plus years ago. They began to say, okay, let's look at the way we are actually treating aging at the moment. You can see on the left, we've got a bunch of age-related diseases that we're all really, really familiar with. And the current practice is that we treat all of these diseases individually. We research them all individually. We have separate institutes for all of these diseases with separate bunches of scientists working on them all. But to be honest, this approach actually isn't really working. We've got huge problems with all of these diseases, despite all the time, money, and effort that goes into the research behind them. And age is actually the underlying risk factor for all of them. Therefore, even if we, hypothetically, even if we found a cure for cancer, we're still going to get dementia. So some people describe it as like a whack-a-mole kind of scenario where even if you cure one, the rest are still going to pop up. So we're in a situation where aging in Western societies, especially where we've got aging societies, we expect the last 20 years of a person's life to be spent in pretty poor health. And this has major social and economic impacts. And it's probably one of the greatest challenges of our time right now. So scientists began to say, okay, what if we just take a completely different approach to aging? Because if the biggest risk factor for all of these diseases is actually your age, then technically, isn't aging the disease? And all of these age-related diseases are just symptoms of aging. And if this is so, then why don't we actually try to target and tackle the real root cause of all these major diseases and actually treat aging? And the idea was that if we did this, would we actually somehow reduce the onset of age-related disease by tackling the root cause? Would this lead to increased health span? So this is exactly what scientists began to do. They began to say, let's look if we can treat aging by slowing cellular aging, and is this going to have an impact on our health span? And initially, many of these scientists, I have to be quite honest, were labelled as crazy, because who had ever heard of anyone trying to cure aging? That's a ridiculous idea. It's a natural thing. We can't interfere. It just happens. But this is exactly what scientists started to do. And actually, there was a lot of shock and a lot of surprise when the results of all of these experiments that they did actually started to come through. Because what all of their work actually demonstrated was that, yes, aging can definitely be slowed. And not only can it be slowed, it can actually also be reversed. And this is massive, because until now, it wasn't thought that you could actually do this. But the main point that I kind of want you to take away from this is not that we're, going to live forever, but actually that these results show that if we slow down the rate of aging, you get a significant increase in health span. So this means better health for our longer lives that we've now been kind of given, that you live in good health rather than suffering. So, we've almost been gifted this longer life thanks to the Industrial Revolution and, medical improvements and things like that. But now there's this opportunity that we might be able to take full advantage of this longer life instead of almost wasting a quarter of it. So I guess the $1,000,000 question that I always get asked is, how do you actually slow aging? So for the second part of this talk, this is exactly what I'm going to take you through. I'm going to take you through some of the key causes of cellular aging and then the discoveries that have actually demonstrated how they can be reversed. But first of all, what I'm going to do is, I don't know what all of your biology backgrounds are like, but I am going to give you a bit of a biology refresh, because I'm going to be talking a lot in this section about aging at a cellular level or a cell biology level. So it's really important that we actually cover some cell biology basics, so that when I'm coming out with all the jargon, you can really follow along with what I'm talking about. So here's my little diagram, and at a very basic level, this is a cell, and every tissue in your body is actually made up out of individual cells. Now, there are a lot of different sizes and shapes, and they work in a lot of different ways, but the fundamental unit of your body is a cell. And there are actually estimated to be about 100 trillion cells in the body, which is just an absolute crazy number to think about. But one way that I like to sort of describe how the cell works is by getting people just to think about it as like a tiny little factory. So there's lots of things it can do. Your cells can make energy using something called the mitochondria, which can be seen at the bottom. And your mitochondria are like tiny little power points in the cell. And they basically take the food that you eat and they convert it into something called ATP, which is the energy currency that our cells need to work. Now, as well as being able to make energy, they can also recycle and repair damaged components. So when any of the little parts of this little cellular factory get damaged, things come along, little enzymes and proteins can come along and repair the damage, or actually recycle the parts and make brand new parts, essentially. The cells are also really good at actually controlling what passes inside and outside the cell, by having great control over their cell membrane. So they really, really can control, what nutrients come into the cell, what things that they let out of the cell. And they can actually send signals to other cells so they can communicate with each other. And finally, in the middle, perhaps the most important part of all, is actually the DNA, which is in the nucleus of the cell. And the DNA is basically the blueprint to life, and it can be read like an instruction guide by the cell to make all cellular components. So everything that is made within your body comes from the DNA instruction guide. So because DNA is so important, and it is something we're going to be talking about a bit, I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail. So you will all know that we have chromosomes. We've got 23 pairs of chromosomes, which are these funny little X-shaped sort of stick-like features. And 23 pairs, one chromosome will be from your mum and one from your dad from each pair. And these chromosomes are basically very long lengths of DNA that are very tightly coiled up. So you'll be familiar with the double helix shape of DNA. Well, basically your chromosomes are just very squashed up and coiled strings of DNA. Now, each length of DNA actually consists of many little short sections of DNA, and these are your genes. And it is these little short sections of DNA, these genes, that act as the sort of individual recipes to make every single part of your body. So anything that's in your body will have some sort of gene that has contributed to the instructions of how that part of the body has to be made. And one really important thing to understand and get your head around is that even though all of our body parts and cells and tissues, etc., are completely different, every single cell in your body actually has identical DNA. It has a full set of 23 chromosomes that are all identical. So it doesn't matter whether it is a muscle cell or a brain cell, they have the same DNA. So this kind of presents a biological problem, because if every single cell has the same DNA and the same instruction guide essentially, well, how on earth does a muscle cell know to become a muscle cell whilst a brain cell knows to become a brain cell? Well, the way it does this is by something called epigenetics, which again is another area of biology that is becoming a lot more understood, and you will definitely start hearing a lot more about it. So epigenetics is actually the ability of the cell to switch on and off particular patterns of genes to instruct the cell to do different things. So basically a muscle cell will sort of switch on a particular pattern of genes, which shows the cell to become a muscle cell, whereas a brain cell will switch on a completely different pattern of genes, so the cell knows to become a brain cell. So you've kind of got these different, sometimes I call them like chords, like playing a chord on the piano, of genes that are being played within a cell to tell the cell actually what to become, and that is called epigenetics. And arguably, epigenetics is more important than genetics, because it's your epigenetics that actually affects what cells become and how they're controlled and things like that. So that's kind of our little cell biology lesson. And the important points to remember from this and to take away is that your cells are basically tiny little factories. They're continually making things, repairing things, recycling things, communicating to each other. And a lot of their efforts are actually focused on maintenance and repair to keep the cells and the body, and most importantly, the DNA, in good health. They've got these energy plants that are called mitochondria that power all of this function. And finally, your epigenetics is just how your cells switch off and on different patterns of genes to control how the cell behaves. Okay, so now we're going to go back to aging. So what actually causes aging? Well, one thing to really understand is that there's not just a single cause of aging. It's not just caused by one thing. There are actually known to be multiple root causes of aging. And in the field, we refer to these as the hallmarks of aging, which can be seen here on the right. Now, there are many different causes of aging, and to be fair, they are pretty complex when you start diving into them. But one thing to point out is that these hallmarks of aging are all actually interlinked. So what I mean by this is that one hallmark or one cause of aging can actually make another hallmark or another cause of aging worse. For example, mitochondrial dysfunction can lead to genomic instability, which is like DNA damage, and this in turn can damage the telomeres, which in turn can cause cellular senescence, which ultimately feeds back and causes even more genomic damage, which creates this vicious cycle of, one thing making the other thing worse, feeding back around. Now, don't worry about understanding all in terms, because I'm going to dive into some of them in a bit more detail. And I'm not going to go through all of them today, because that would be total information overload. But I'm actually going to cover 4 of them in this session. And the ones that we're really going to go into a bit more detail on are, first of all, mitochondrial dysfunction, then cellular senescence, genomic instability, and deregulated nutrient sensing. So, first one, mitochondrial dysfunction. So, we all know from our previous slide and our little picture of the cell that the mitochondria are the little energy powerhouses in the cell. Now, the unfortunate thing is that they actually start to dysfunction as we get older. And this is a real problem, because what these mitochondria do is they produce ATP. And this is the energy form that our cells absolutely need to function. And the mitochondria take the food we eat and convert it into ATP. And this ATP basically powers everything in the cell. So it's really important. But as we age, or our cells age, our mitochondria actually lose their ability to make this cellular energy, and this has a huge impact on all aspects of cellular health, because ATP is actually driving most of these critical cellular functions. So as the mitochondria become dysfunctional, they basically stop producing as much ATP, and all of these critical processes in the cell are fighting over the energy demands that they have. Remember when I was talking about DNA repair and cellular maintenance, things are energy expensive to the cell? Well, now, as you get older, your cells have even less energy to go around. The other real downside, I guess, of your mitochondria becoming dysfunctional as you get older is that they kind of start releasing harmful reactive oxygen species that actually can damage the cell's DNA. So again, thinking of our little factory analogy, it's like these power plants have become like really old and actually are leaking toxic waste, and actually need to be like decommissioned. They're sort of past the working life. But they don't. They can actually be recycled by the cell, but actually as we get older, many of them don't. Many of these mitochondria sort of continue to exist in the cell, and they are spewing out these harmful reactive oxygen species, which is bouncing off our DNA and actually damaging it, which is bad, because as we mentioned earlier, your DNA is incredibly important. So this leads on to another hallmark, genomic instability, also known as DNA damage, and it shows a link between two hallmarks. Because we've already mentioned DNA is really, really important to the cell. So perhaps it's unsurprising that DNA damage is a key hallmark and a key cause of aging in the cell. So the problem that we have is that as we get older, DNA damage actually accumulates, because as mentioned earlier, everything is pretty much trying to continuously harm our DNA. You've got UV light from the sun, free radicals from our mitochondria, even more so as we get older and they become dysfunctional. You've got toxins, chemicals. We're looking at 10,000 DNA damage events per day in our cells. And this is huge. And it explains why our bodies have to be so well adapted to actually repair the DNA when we're young. Because they're really good at this. You've got DNA repair enzymes that are constantly going along your genome, checking if there's any breaks, and if there is a break, they're signaling and they're actually repairing it. So although all this damage is going on inside us, we don't even know it's happening because our body's just constantly dealing with it, at least when we're young, that is anyway. However, when we get older and our cells are aging, what happens is that this capacity to repair DNA damage actually reduces with age, and the DNA damage begins to accumulate in the cell. And because DNA is fundamental for controlling the activity of your cell, when it's damaged, it can actually lead to multiple issues in the cells, which actually in turn causes a lot of other hallmarks of aging. For example, senescent cells, which is the third hallmark of aging that we're going to talk about. But what on earth are senescent cells? Because many people that I speak to within the field kind of look at me blankly. They might have heard of mitochondria or DNA, but when I start talking about senescent cells, that's when people, really look at me like, what on earth are you actually talking about? So we're going to dive a bit deeper into this one to understand what senescence and senescent cells actually are. So let's remember, our cells are really, really precious about protecting their DNA, and they will do everything and anything to repair it when we are young. Now, the problem is, sometimes, despite all of this incredible repair capability, a cell will get so much DNA damage that actually it can no longer repair itself, And the cell basically sets off a signal to say, okay, this cell is a write-off, it's got so much damage, there's nothing we can do for it, the cell needs to be shut down completely. And this is really important, this shutdown mechanism, because faulty DNA can cause a cell to become cancerous. And if we die of cancer when we're young, then we're not going to be able to reproduce and pass on our DNA to our children. So as far as evolution was concerned, it was very important that DNA was repaired, and that if there was any DNA that couldn't repair and had the potential to make a cell cancerous, that cell had to just be closed off as quick as possible to protect our bodies so we could go on and live a healthy life and reproduce. So basically what happens is these senescent cells, or the cells that have been signalled as a write-off, are just shut down. And the body does this by effectively putting the cells to sleep. Now, it doesn't actually get rid of them. It doesn't recycle them. They simply just stay there, sitting in the tissue, but they have been shut down, asleep. It's kind of the same thing if you think of the factory analogy of this factory is being closed, all the work is being taken out, and the building is just sitting there to go derelict. And the reason that the body kind of doesn't recycle them and remove them is because it's quite energy demanding to do that. And actually, when we're young, it's easier just to sort of pull the plug, put the cells to sleep, and leave them in place. And this mechanism is called senescence. And it's very young when we're young because it stops us getting cancer and it gets us past the point of reproduction. But the problem that we've got now is that we are living much longer lives. So evolution sort of developed this mechanism when we were living at age 30 or 40, but we're now living to 80 or 90. So now that we're living much longer, there's a lot more of these sleeping senescent cells in our bodies, and they actually are known to actually really accumulate with age. And over recent years, what has been found is that these cells don't actually just sit there sleeping quietly. It's actually known that they secrete a lot of inflammation. And they kind of act a bit like rotten apples, because what happens is they secrete inflammation, which actually causes the cells around them to become damaged. Then they get so damaged that they become senescent, and then they're shut down, then they're secreting inflammation. And it's kind of like, having a rotten apple in a fruit bowl where one goes bad and then it causes everything around to gradually go bad. It's kind of like the same idea as that. And this is a huge problem because it means by the time we're reaching the older ages that we live to today, it's estimated that up to 30% of our tissues and organs are actually made up of these senescent cells that are just simply sitting there, taking up space, not performing their function, and actually secreting a lot of inflammation. And the fact that when I talk about taking up space in a tissue, this is often correlated with when organs actually start to fail. So if you look in older people who have kidney failure and heart failure, which is very common in advanced ages, if you look at their heart and their kidneys and their organs, they've got a really high proportion of these senescent cells that are just not contributing to the healthy function of a tissue. And this is why our organs start to fail, our skin starts to sag, our muscles start to waste. All of these things can be, linked to senescence. So you're kind of probably thinking, well, why on earth would our bodies do this to themselves? Because that's effectively what's happening. Our body is doing this senescence process. But this is a perfect example of something that only makes sense when viewed in the light of evolution, which is what I mentioned earlier. So back in the day, when we didn't live past 40, this was an excellent way for the body to quickly shut down any damaged cells without using much effort or without using much energy. And there was no problem of this accumulation or this mass inflammation because we simply didn't live long enough for that ever to become a problem. But now that everyone's living until they're 80, the majority of your tissues by this age will be made up of these senescent zombie cells, like some people sort of refer to them as. So scientists began to say, okay, If these cells are so bad and they actually accumulate as we get older, then why don't we just remove them as we get older? So that has been a huge area of research in the aging field, looking at designing special drugs called senolytics that are designed to basically selectively remove these senescent cells but not touch the healthy cells. And the results from these studies have been, absolutely mind-blowing, because they've shown that just by removing even a small proportion of these senescent cells, there are huge health benefits. They were finding in mammals that you could restore organ health, eye function, fitness, skin quality, memory, loss of frailty, 50% less cancer. Looking in terms of health span and in terms of the things we're suffering with old age, that's kind of like you're hitting all of the major ones with one therapy. So this is demonstrating how rethinking the way that we look at aging and treat aging and actually target aging as the root cause can actually have a huge impact on our health span. Now, the final hallmark that I'm going to talk about today is deregulated nutrient sensing and a molecule called NAD. And I'm going to talk about NAD decline because I like to call NAD the most important molecule for life that you've probably never heard of. And this is because it is so important that if you didn't have it in your body, you would literally be dead in 30 seconds, which is pretty scary. So NAD is a natural molecule which is found within every single cell of your body, and it's important for two major things. The first is it helps produce cellular energy in the mitochondria. So when I talked about that process of converting the food that you eat into the energy that your cells need to function, well, that pathway that actually makes that happen in the mitochondria, NAD is a critical part of that. Without NAD in that pathway, you simply wouldn't be able to make any energy in your cells, and that is why you would die in 30 seconds. Now, as well as energy production, NAD is also critically important in cellular maintenance and repair, because what it does is it basically acts as a signal in the cells to switch maintenance and repair processes off and on. So because of this, NAD is sometimes described as a metabolic sensor in the cell, because actually its levels fluctuate depending on the energy state of the cell, which allows the cell to respond accordingly. For example, if the cell undergoes a period of nutritional stress, your NAD levels will increase, and what this does is it signals to the cell that food is scarce, so it needs to increase its own energy production, up the maintenance of repair and recycling, and basically look after the cell during the time of stress so it can survive it. Now, on the other hand, if nutrients are plentiful, if we're eating burgers all day, NAD will drop. The cell gets that signal to say, well, it can almost be wasteful, there's abundance of energy coming in, and it can turn down maintenance and repair because nutrients and energy are abundantly available. So remember I said in terms of, earlier that the body's main purpose in evolutionary terms is to protect its DNA. Well, NAD is also critically important for switching on all of the genes and the pathways that actually protect your DNA in your cells and your body, which gives an indication of just how important NAD really is for aging. Now, the problem that has been identified is that NAD levels actually decline quite rapidly with age. In fact, it's estimated that your NAD in your cells declines around 50% every 20 years, which is quite scary considering how important this is. So when we're young, you've got really high levels, but as you get older, these levels decline, and this makes it really hard for your cells to actually sustain the vital processes such as energy production, DNA repair, cellular maintenance. And when NAD becomes persistently low, this results in an accumulation of damage that actually leads to many of the symptoms and negative health consequences that we associate with aging. So the good news is is that there is now a lot of scientific evidence which shows that actually if you don't let your NAD levels decline as you get older, or in fact you boost your NAD levels back to youthful levels, it can actually have incredible health benefits. So there are hundreds of scientific papers now that have shown that by increasing your NAD levels, you can not only improve cellular energy levels, but you can restore muscle function, improve cognitive function, repair damaged DNA, increase insulin sensitivity, so improve your metabolic function, improve your vascular function. It offers cardiovascular protection. In fact, in some of the key studies that have been done, scientists working with NAD have discovered that by replacing NAD in aged cells and tissues, that they could actually reverse age-related damage back to a youthful state. In other words, if you look at these papers, they could no longer actually tell the difference between the old and young tissues. That's how incredible the results were. So as a result, many scientists now, within the field now really believe that maintaining high levels of NAD as you age is actually one of the most promising ways to combat the aging process. So that was probably quite a lot to take in, and there's so much more to learn, but just to summarize what we've kind of gone through today, with some key points to sort of take away. Hopefully you understand now why aging occurs. It occurs because we are now just living a lot longer than our bodies were simply designed for. And science and scientific breakthroughs have now unequivocally demonstrated that actually multiple age-related issues can be improved by targeting cellular aging. So we can improve our health span by slowing cellular aging. The other important thing to really take away is aging isn't just one thing. It has multiple root causes. But the good news is that we're now really starting to understand at a cellular biology level what is actually going on, and more importantly, how we can actually impact this cellular biology to actually slow and even reverse aging by targeting these root causes. Now, today we've covered a couple of these hallmarks, such as, DNA damage, removal of senescent cells with special senolytic molecules, boosting cellular NAD back up to youthful levels, and they have all been shown to be promising strategies for actually slowing cellular aging. So, thank you for getting to the end of this webinar with me. As I mentioned at the start, our mission, or my mission at Nichido, is to really take all of these latest breakthroughs that I've been talking to you today about in the field of aging and actually translate them into consumer products that people can benefit from now. And that is what we have been working on for the last 4.5 years at Nichido. And, we have been able to actually bring out products that actually do this. We have an NAD supplement that actually boosts cellular NAD levels back to youthful levels. And we have tested this in clinical testing to show that it actually does work. Now, NAD is, I briefly spoke about it today, but it's a huge area of science in itself. And I hope you might be able to join us for another webinar where I'll actually be discussing the benefits of restoring NAD in a lot more detail. So please join us for that one. So thank you very much for attending today. If you've got any questions at all, I'm more than happy for you to reach out and actually contact me on any of the methods on the screen now. And I will do my best to get back to you and try and help with any queries that you may have. So thank you very much, everyone. And I will end that there.